It's important to remember that Faust was something Goethe was working on for many decades. This is not a rip from his desk and thrust off into the world thing. He was rewriting and revising and developing and scrapping and crossing stuff out for years and years and years. And it bears the marks of that somewhat violent birth process. He developed it from a very well-known legend, which has its comparisons with the Prometheus legend of a god stealing fire to give to mankind. The idea of inspiration and bringing a kind of new light into the world. Faust is a kind of a dark end of that same figure. And he existed in German legend for a long time. It goes back to medieval folk tales, quite frankly. Very famously, Christopher Marlowe in England wrote a play about him, Dr. Faustus. At the time that Goethe got to him, it was a very popular form of children's entertainment, quite frankly. It was being retrofitted for children's formatting. It was very big in puppet shows, which gives you a little idea of the target demographic there. The puppet shows. Also, a number of stories that would be pruned and curtailed for their moral instruction, about everybody sort of staying in their place and not getting too hoity-toity and not dealing with the devil at all. Oh my God. And there are all sorts of, Sunday school overtones to that existed in the culture for quite some time. But when he was still a relatively young artist, Goethe, in the throes of the Sturm und Drang movement, came up with the idea of playing with this character, this theme. And he produced what is known to scholars as the Ur-Faust. And that is the origin of it. And it is a little rough. It is a little incomplete. And he just ground it out around 1790. He's still a very young man. But in it, he is working with some of the same themes that will hold true to the work throughout its many different gestations. He thought of it largely as a poem. He thought of himself mostly as a poet, even though his first big hit was in the theater. But this is specifically a kind of play that is known as a closet drama. And that is a play that is meant to be read. It's not something that you can really realistically expect anybody to squeeze on a stage. And if you read the play, you can see, wow, how are they ever going to make that happen? This is not like Greek theater where you have three characters, no set, and it's just them talking in the full sunshine, the middle of the day on bare boards. That's not what this is. This is much more elaborate. And you can see him working within that convention because his mind cannot be contained. He is overflowing with creative juices, with energy, and with inspiration. You cannot contain something like inspiration in the Romantic era. Very, very different from the Enlightenment. The text itself, it is mostly made up of poetry. There are a few chunks. They were there in the Ur-Faust version and remain. There are a few chunks that are prosy. Most of it is, however, in verse, and observing metrical and rhyme schemes and the general characteristics of poetry. And specifically, he is writing a kind of compendium of Germanic poetry. If you go back to the earliest German poetry in the medieval age, the barbarians practically of the North Country as they started out, we have some works of those, the Minnesingers and whatever. They worked in certain forms of poetry that they adopted and developed for their own use, and Goethe is using them here. But then also a considerable number of the late medieval metrical forms are here, and a considerable number of the Renaissance metrical forms and rhyme schemes are here. And he is playing with all this and making this a kind of encyclopedia of literature in German up to that point. And in the process, almost preparing it to take the next step after him. So it is a remarkable document in the way that it catalogs and collects archival styles of past art. It also exists as a archive of his own styles. You can see, because he wrote it over so many decades, he was always correcting it or always changing it, but he did leave significant chunks of it from each era of his work. And so you can see scholars point to evidence of lines that he probably wrote when he was very young and in the highly emotive, flourishing Sturm und Drang movement, very emotional, very overwrought, very melodramatic, and that has that particular character. But you can also see the era after that, when he was more settled, his classical Weimar classicism phase, where he was entranced with after a trip to Italy, and he became much more settled and staid and easy, let's say. And then after that, even, there is scholars point to a different phase again, as he started to get away from his classical mode and become more his own voice and settle into a more idiosyncratic tone of his own. And scholars will point to all of these different things swimming around in there already. And that can make this just as rich. And you have to think of this as a kind of process of composition, because you can see all this stuff mixing around in there, and he is working on many different levels at the same time. He is breaking with very well-established rules about play organization, about drama, the rules of drama that have been in place really since Aristotle coined them. He is flaunting them in many respects, like a particular idol of his, Shakespeare. He was a little rare for his time in his admiration for Shakespeare, who, this is 150 years after Shakespeare's death, more so actually, more than that, almost 200 by the time Goethe died. The experience of Shakespeare is, of course, very tied to the English language. He exists in translations all over the world, and I'm sure they're all wonderful. But realistically, it is difficult for foreign audiences to access that. Goethe had read Shakespeare in the original and developed a huge fondness for him and his willingness to take dramatic risks, creative risks, how to sway away from the Aristotelian models of what good drama is, and get a little bit creative and saying, well, how about we break from the unity of time and space, and now we can have a character over here at this time, and then we can just jump, days, weeks, decades into the future for the next scene. And that is somehow going to make sense to the audience. And, audiences aren't that dumb. They can keep up. So he was right. So he is experimenting with that, again, within the writing context, because how did he really experience Shakespeare most often? Through reading it rather than seeing it on stage. So that's, again, sort of behind the whole closet drama thing. But that difficulty of following along. This is not an easy play to read. And I say read because most people read it these days. It is not staged very often for obvious reasons. But it can be even difficult to read because they are working with so many different meters, and the translators generally, and these are pretty good translations here, try and reproduce some of the metrical characteristics of the original text so that you can distinguish, like, all right, this one is a little bit more archaic, and this one has this a more mellow Renaissance feel, and the comparisons of those two. So when you're reading it, it can be a little herky jerky from time to time. It can be like, what? It's very difficult to follow from time to time. Not impossible, but not easy. And the quirks of the staging of it can be a little difficult to imagine as you start to come up with stuff like, okay, reading any play is difficult because you're essentially reading a blueprint. And that blueprint is difficult to imagine unless you're a professional, how that would translate into a reality. Here, you're trying to do that, and you're trying to do that with the idea that this isn't really a blueprint for anything that will become anything like reality. And that was in many ways the theme of the work as a whole. Because in it, think about this. The story is that this character, Faust, has reached the limits of human knowledge. He knows everything that he can learn, and he is frustrated with that, and he wants to crack out of that. He wants to break through those boundaries and discover the undiscovered country, let's say, to pierce the mysteries of the universe in a way that only gods and divine beings can. And that is, in its way, on a formal level, what this play is kind of doing by cracking out of the narrow limitations of the physical reality on that stage, in that building. There is a spirit of defiance that breathes through this that is intoxicating when you recognize what he's really doing. For the most part, what he's really doing is recognized primarily by other artists. He is a lodestone for future creativity. Musicians have had a lot of fun with this theme, particularly his treatment of it. Composers like Beethoven, Berlioz, Liszt, Mahler, they have all crafted significant compositions based on Goethe's Faust. The German novelist Thomas Mann credited Goethe with teaching him so much about everything that he wrote, and Mann, in fact, wrote a Dr. Faustus novel. So he was very much involved in that theme and the working out of those same problems. And for me, probably one of the most interesting ones is a cinematic rendition. In 1926, early German film industry, the great director F.W. Murnau produces the film Faust. Murnau is already a superstar at the height of his powers of reimagining wild flights of psychological intrigue and fantasy and horror, quite frankly. And here he teams up with the great German actor Emil Jannings, and they just go to town on this material. And you can, this is up there in YouTube, and you can find this film, and I would encourage everybody to watch it. It is in German, but it's a silent movie with subtitles, so it doesn't really matter. But just the visuals themselves are astounding. So that gets it. But the thing that really starts striking when you consider that also is that Murnau made this movie 100 years ago, and it is brilliant, and it is doing things that Goethe could not imagine having accomplished on the stage with the limited technical resources available to him in the early 1800s. Murnau could take that and explode it into a whole new realm. And what I find really interesting is speculating on, well, what if somebody did that now? What if somebody picked that up now? There have been other versions, but imagine what this can be done with a full scale, super Hollywood, high tech digital filmmaking, FX driven extravaganza. This could be so damn cool. And that just reiterates to you how far ahead of his time Goethe was in writing this. He was pushing boundaries in every possible way because this is the story that the German nation, generally the people of Germany, come back to, but so much of the rest of us can come and find new inspiration from, new ideas born, so that we can all take part in that basic journey of cracking out of our narrow lives and imagining something more extravagant, something more mystical, magical, divine. That alchemy, and he was very into alchemy, that alchemy is at the heart of everything that we're going to explore in this play.